The amount of newly discovered vulnerabilities increases exponentially each year, and most organizations struggles to keep on top of them. Our next speaker will help us to get an improved understanding of how to think about critical risk areas and what steps to take in order to mobilize your organization against it. Our speaker has an extensive experience in his career across IT, software development, telecoms, and cybersecurity. And he's currently responsible for developing and managing the Integrity 360 group portfolio of cybersecurity services and solutions. Give a warm welcome to the Director of Product Management at Integrity 360, Brian Martin.
Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here for my second Security First event in Stockholm. Hopefully the second of many more. And great, as Nick said, great to see a fantastic turnout today. I'm going to talk about exposure management, as Nick referenced earlier, and a new way to think about managing all the exposures that you have in your business. I'm going to start with a picture of some chickens on a beach, because actually, we all face exposure in our daily lives, both personally and professionally. So it's really about how you manage your exposures. So as you can see, all these chickens are, experiencing the same exposure, but one hasn't managed it very well and has ended up getting roasted. So I think that's a nice little metaphor for how to think about exposure management in your organization as well. So I'm just going to talk about what is exposure, different types of exposure, and crucially, how do attackers leverage exposure? Because I think we have to understand that in order to manage it correctly. If we don't understand how those exposures are being used, how can we possibly make the right decisions about which exposures to tackle first? I'm going to talk about threat exposure management and continuous threat exposure management, and then sum up with some takeaways. So what is an exposure? Well, it's really anything bad, anything that can be exploited by a bad actor to achieve their goals. I think you really got to widen that definition and the thinking around what do we mean by exposure, because if an attacker can leverage it, they will, and they'll insert it into the attack chain in some way. So I think you've got to think about exposure being anything that can be leveraged, and that really opens your mind to what you need to be worried about. And there are lots of trends exacerbating the exposure attack surface. There's the work from anywhere era. I saw this cartoon on a flight in a magazine on a flight recently, where there's the interviewee is sitting there on the laptop. The interview panel is asking politely, is there any chance you might occasionally be okay to drop into the office? And, that whole era of working from anywhere is around to stay. And that means the traditional attack surface has widened considerably, because now our people, our assets are working from anywhere. They're working from the train, they're working from cafes, they're working from the office and from our customers' offices. And they're using cloud-based applications, SaaS applications. So that represents quite an enormous attack surface. Cloud continues apace in terms of its growth, and in spite of it being around for quite a while, from what I see, we haven't really got the grips with it yet, particularly from a security perspective. I think some of the challenges in cybersecurity in terms of skills are also present in terms of cloud, in terms of how to leverage the cloud, the lift and shift model versus the cloud native type approach, and then all the security wrap around that. So that's still a big attack surface. And the cloud has really mushroomed and exploded out the attack surface, because now you've got so much application, so much data, so much accessibility up there in the cloud. That also represents a massive attack surface. And then finally, we've got the likes of IoT growing by up to 20% per annum. OT investments continuing to grow close to 20% per annum. And the amount of data being generated every day is growing by roughly 23% per annum, 90% of which is unstructured data. So you've got data lying around in in share, on laptops, in OneDrive, in SharePoint, in various forms of applications, and in the likes of databases and elsewhere. And that also represents quite a significant attack surface that needs to be managed. So you've got this attack surface, and you do your best to put your protection around it. And I don't mean a kind of a physical kind of protection. Everything isn't neatly contained within a network perimeter, but logically speaking, we put in as much protection as we can to try and prevent the bad stuff happening. However, that protection has gaps in it, and those gaps represent exposures. And we put it, Nick talked about resilience and detection and response. So we put in detection and response in order to cope with handling breaches in our protections, so we can pick up on those tactics, techniques, procedures, and respond to them accordingly with the right appropriate level of prioritization. And what the attackers do, they leverage these exposures. They try and get in. Our detection and response can either autonomously or potentially with the help of the SOC or with a service provider. We repel the majority of those types of attacks, but occasionally something gets through. So if you think about cybersecurity very holistically, I think it's a sort of a dance going on between putting in protections, locking down as much as possible, putting in detection and response for the inevitable breakthroughs, but then how do you handle the exposures and that continuous exposure management being a critical other pillar you need to think about. Vulnerability management is a problem that unfortunately is not going away. It almost looks like becoming an exponential curve here in the number of CVEs, newly detected CVEs every year. And many organizations struggle to deal with that. So a quick poll, just a bit of audience interaction here. So hands up, how many of you find managing vulnerabilities easy within your organization? This is my 4th security first, and so far nobody's put up their hand. In the UK, in Ireland, and in 2 locations in Ireland, now in Stockholm. And I know it's hard and nobody wants to put up their hand and then, say everything's okay, because we're naturally, as security people, reluctant to always rest on our laurels and think that everything is covered. But it is quite notable that, a lot of organizations, in fact, most organizations, aren't happy with how they're managing their vulnerabilities. And even implementing some best practice like risk-based vulnerability management, which is a Gartner methodology. We have all these different types of methods, between DAST, pen testing, security posture management, vulnerability assessment, external attack surface management. You feed it into a continuous loop of assessment, prioritization, and then your compensating controls. So this represents quite a step forward in terms of how you should be managing your vulnerabilities. Another quick poll: how many people here are implementing a risk-based vulnerability management process or something similar to this? Yep. Again, there was a few people there. So I think that is, I've seen that as well. Nobody's really happy with their vulnerability management, but there are organizations who are doing the best they can implementing risk-based vulnerability management. But even Gartner, who came up with this approach, said that this approach may not be sufficient, and fixing every known vulnerability or even the ones you prioritize can be operationally infeasible. For a variety of reasons, a lot of us know about. And I'm not going to make your lives even worse, because the problem is it's not just vulnerabilities. When you widen that definition of exposures, then you're into vulnerabilities, misconfiguration, identities and permissions, security controls that maybe are in place but are not functioning correctly, the misuse of SaaS applications, even your people. Your people are assets and represent an exposure. If they're uneducated, if they're doing the wrong thing, then that represents an exposure to your business. Your physical security is also an exposure. And poor if you talk to our red teaming professionals who do a lot of the physical security testing, they say one of the easiest way to get into a customer's environment is through physical breach, just slipping into a building quite easily and attaching something to the network, and they're in, and they've got persistent access. Supply chain. Think about your supply chain and all of the, in recent years, the types of vulnerabilities and exposures that have crept in to the environment via the supply chain route. Credentials that could be leaked on the dark web. They could be cached credentials that once a threat actor is inside, they gain access to the cached credentials. These represent exposures as well. And of course, AI, which we already talked about. So what's the solution? Well, I believe that security leaders must become CEOs. And you're sitting here thinking, well, that's a bit drastic. So I have to actually run the entire company in order to make it secure. And certainly that's one method. And I know there's a lot of people here who are ambitious and potentially aspire to that. But another way to think about it is to become a chief exposure officer. And as security people within our organizations, we're the people that need to think about exposure. We need to be the chief exposure officers and really think about the ones worrying about what exposures are being introduced, represented by different activity going on in the business, and also the posture of the overall business as well. So I'm going to use AI as an example for how to become a CEO. And I think no presentation is complete without at least one meme. So I'm going to throw in a meme here, and this memeiest of memes is this one. I think we've all seen this one before. So think about AI as turning heads in terms of what it offers, productivity gains, cost savings. They've got the business here being very interested, and the security leaders going, maybe not so fast, or, have a think about what you're doing there. So what is the chief exposure officer mindset when it comes to AI? Well, there's a few different aspects to it. So AI creates new exposures. Think about the unauthorized access and the data leakage potential of someone with their AI account being breached. And that could be as simple as a regular user who's got Copilot in their environment, and they get breached, and suddenly whatever's at their fingertips across your business is also available now to the threat actor. That can magnify the impact of a breach. Maybe you don't even need privilege escalation anymore to gain a lot of information. It points to a whole load of issues around information governance and data classification and labeling and access permissions that can to help lock that down. AI can turbocharge exposure exploitation. And we hear a lot about deep fakes and social engineering becoming a lot richer now with audio synthesis of just by hearing a small clip of someone's voice, you can synthesize their voice. Same with video. AI-led attack automation and advanced phishing, and that's the bit about how much of that is coming, when is it coming, when will it reach prime time, but it's definitely on the way. But then also on the positive side, on the defender side, just so that Nick can lie on the beach in his hammock, AI has the potential to give us a lot more visibility around what exposures we actually have, more advanced tooling, the co-pilotization of the SOC, if you like, to really level up everybody who's working in that environment with support from natural language queries about what's going on and how to respond to attacks. And we're already seeing that technology and that capability coming into the tool sets that we're working with every day. So how do attackers leverage exposures? Well, it's rarely just one. Now, we hear about initial access and then lateral movement, privilege escalation. The MITRE ATT&CK framework has all of these different tactics that attackers use. And what attackers do is they leverage multiple exposures to build attack paths. So they might get in via they might do a bit of enumeration, and then they find a vulnerability. They might get in, or they might use a phishing attack. Then they'll gain initial access, potentially via man in the middle of attack. Um, then they might find some cache credentials and expand their access internally, move laterally, and so on and so forth. So really, this idea of if you talk to our red team, professional services people who do this every day, generally they chain these things together. They find the most appropriate way to get in initially, and then they move laterally within the environment. And that's why with exposure management, you need to think about the full picture, not just one. And in order to understand your exposures, you need to understand your attack surface. But 71% of organizations don't actually fully understand their attack surface. So that's a really, really important thing to address. You need to understand your attack surface, the exposures, and the attack paths that could be leveraged through that environment. You need to constantly monitor for new ones because, let's face it, a new exposure can open up at any moment in time. Someone could misconfigure a device, a port, or a new vulnerability could become apparent in the wild, being exploited or whatnot. And understanding the attack paths gives you the ability then to find out how can I choke off those attack paths. So identifying, choking off attack paths will help you reduce your risk. But exposure management can feel a little bit like, I don't know what this is called in Sweden. We call it whack-a-mole, where the thing pops up and you no sooner have you knocked one down, another one pops up. So how do we prioritise the remediation of this exposures? Well, if you look at traditional risk management, the very most simplest formula in risk management is risk is probability times impact. So translate that into risk management. The criticality of the exposure is the likelihood of exploitation, which has a number of factors, the severity of the exposure, ease of exploitation, number of active exploits available, is it being actively exploited in the wild by threat actors targeting your type of profile. So there's all these factors that feed into criticality exposure. And then, of course, there's the impact, which is, yes, of course, asset criticality is important. If that asset is hosting your crown jewels data, then that is obviously really, really important. But also, is it present on an attack path to the critical asset? Is it present on multiple attack paths to the critical asset or assets? And then the impact of those assets being compromised. So all of these factors, so really, exposure severity and asset criticality alone is not nearly enough to determine the priority of your remediation plan. And exposure remediation prioritization is critical. And last week I gave this presentation in Belfast, and I was a bit nervous because they designed and built the Titanic in Belfast. I thought actually for this week I should have used the Vasa ship and used the same analogy, but I only thought about it yesterday, so it was too late to make changes. But anyway, you see the officers here with the rearranging the deck chairs because a passenger might trip and hurt themselves. Meanwhile, you've got this exposure. There's an exposure there. But there's a threat on the horizon, the iceberg. But the real exposure was that the bulkheads were not watertight, and there was an assumption made with the Titanic that 4 of the forward bulkheads could be breached, and it wouldn't sink. But what happened was they turned the ship at the last minute, and 6 of the bulkheads were breached. Water came in, and that design, not making those other bulkheads watertight, was purely aesthetic. They didn't want bulkheads or walls coming up through the decks. So they said, listen, it'll never get breached, so therefore we're safe. So we can make it nice and convenient for the passengers. But that was an invalid no breach assumption. A bit like thinking that I only have to worry about my externally facing assets. But unfortunately, that breach happened. And then the water came in via the decks into the bulkhead, into the compartments below that were not watertight, and the ship sank tragically with the loss of many lives. So on top of that, they also had an inadequate response plan. There wasn't nearly enough lifeboat spaces for the passengers, and also even the processes, like the rules around women and children only or women and children first wasn't clear. The rules were different depending on which side of the ship you're on. So that resulted in only 60% of the lifeboat places were actually used. So the point here really is this is just like a kind of an extreme example of where you're focusing on the wrong thing, whereas really the real exposure was that internal exposure that caused the ultimate tragedy. So what is threat exposure management? Well, there are three main pillars to it. So you've got managing your vulnerabilities, managing your entire attack surface. So not just the vulnerability side on your externally facing assets, but thinking about your full attack surface. So that's IT, IoT, OT, your people, the cloud, your digital risk, things that have leaked potentially in the open, deep and dark web, your supply chain and your people. And then, as I said, exposures are never static. So it needs to be continuously a continuous test and validation of your exposures so that you can see, first of all, validate the ones you fixed are fixed, and then secondly, make sure no new ones have popped in. Why is threat exposure management such a hot topic? Well, if you look at the hype cycle for security operations and you actually look down through all the emerging technology across different phases of the hype cycle, the vast majority relates in one way or another to threat exposure management. So I think you'll see, vulnerability assessment and prioritization is relatively mature, but there's all sorts of new emerging technologies. So that's just a hint to show you that, the whole industry is really starting to think a lot more seriously about managing exposures more holistically. And then the continuous side is really just a process. It's like a program that you put in place within your organization. It's an integrated, iterative approach to prioritizing potential treatments and continually refining your security posture. You combine the attackers and the defenders' views to minimize the exposure and the risks. So there's a number of stages to a C10 program. You start with the scoping of your critical assets, your attack surface, your posture management in SaaS and cloud, digital risk, etc. You go through a discovery phase, and you don't have to boil the ocean in one go. Like you can start a program and even just bring in your vulnerability management into it and then expand it out in an iterative process based on the relative priorities of what you're trying to cover. Then you prioritize, you validate, and you mobilize in terms of an implementation side. And I think there's ways of thinking about the maturity of your threat exposure management. So there's three kind of dimensions of the maturity of threat exposure management, in my view. And this is the me/integrity view of maturity dimensions of threat exposure management. So it's your asset coverage scope. So you start out, you've got some foundational things. You need to be covering most of your IT assets. Hopefully, all of them. As you get into the mature stage, all your IT assets are being covered. But then you're also thinking about your people, making sure, you're doing all the right testing and training for your people, cloud, that you put security controls around your cloud in terms of understanding those exposures and misconfigurations, mobile, IoT and OT. And this is not prescriptive. Each business will be different. If you're an OT heavy organization, maybe where your business lives or dies on manufacturing or utilities or whatnot, then your OT security and exposure management would be much more foundational, if you like, in that case. Then you've got the dimensions of the scope of exposures that you're looking at. So you start out with vulnerabilities and misconfigurations and security awareness. Then you're getting into privileged identities, then all identities, because all identities represent an exposure, your cloud security posture, right up to monitoring your VIPs and checking that any exposures around your critical people in the business. Then you've got your management process scope and dimension, which is starting with vulnerability management, then looking at things like external attack surface management, your pen testing controls, your cyber asset surface management, and so on and so forth, right up to from the advanced stage into continuous threat exposure management. So the goal should be to move up the curve on all three dimensions. So you could almost see your continuous threat exposure management being concentric circles that grow over time as you bring more into scope relative to the priority. And by 2026, organizations prioritizing their security investments based on CTEM are expected to be 3 times less likely to suffer a breach, if you believe Gartner's view. So that's it. So attackers' chain exposures, they expand. So make sure you expand your concept of exposure beyond vulnerabilities. Make sure you look at the full attack surface, internal and external. Analyze your attack paths. Make sure you understand those and what the choke points are to your critical assets to help inform your prioritization. Think about those 3 dimensions of maturity around threat exposure management, and consider introducing a form of continuous threat exposure management in your organization. And ultimately, become a CEO, become a chief exposure officer, and then, unlike the chicken in the first picture, hopefully you won't get burnt. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian, for a very interesting presentation. And I would also like to mention that many of these presentations will be available for you to grab from the event side after the event.